Hello, I'm Alex McLaren. I'm an actor and I've worked as a communications coach since 2002. Now so much business is being conducted remotely, the ways in which we talk, present, build relationships and connect is changing. In this podcast, I want to explore all those issues and prove to you that no matter who you are, you can talk to anyone. Hello and welcome to You Can Talk to Anyone. I'm Alex McLaren.
And I'm Tom Zielinski.
And this week's topic is locker room talk, how boys talk to boys and girls talk to girls. And I'm very conscious that there's two boys in this conversation and no girls at the moment.
And this is a very binary conversation, Alex.
Yes,
this is very reductive.
Yes, indeed. Hello, everybody out there who don't classify themselves in either of those binaries, and we'll try and fold everybody into this conversation as much as possible. But we have to start from where we are, and I suppose this feels like a really spicy conversation to talk about. Listeners, please treat our hesitancies as openness rather than just paralyzed anxiety. I'm interested in why this would come up, and I'm thinking that when I'm running sessions with people, I'm very conscious of the gender balance in the room. When we met, Tom, as part of an improvisation company, it was very deliberate on behalf of you and Deborah that there was a 50-50 boys and girls split in the team. Do you remember that? Okay, tell me a little bit about it.
Well, as in a great many professions, comedy and improvisation is something which boys tend to dominate. And especially when you and I were starting, there weren't very many prominent female comedians on the telly. In fact, even 10 years ago, there were maybe half the number that there are today. It really has changed dramatically in the time that you and I have been contributing to the world. So we didn't want to be telling stories about boys doing boy things in boyland with an occasional token woman to be the secretary or the nurse. We wanted to try and encompass a richer, more diverse range of human experience.
Yes, but I'm thinking of the gender balance of the groups I've been part of as an actor. When you start out in performing at school, you'll find that if you're at a mixed school, as I was, that there's loads and loads of girls want to be performing. And so that in the audition stage, the girls massively outnumber the boys. But if you look at the repertoire,
when the parts actually start getting cast.
That's
exactly,
right.
Yes, all the good parts are for the boys.
The boys do all the talking. When my son was at primary school, every year I'd do a kind of gender audit of the casting of the nativity play. And it always produced quite interesting results. And also the conversation, which often took place on Facebook on the PTA site, was often very kind of polarized and emotional, in which people would, I'd often find myself trying to fly the flag on behalf of the girls in the group. I wish they were doing more talking. And then the mothers of those girls would tell me, she doesn't want to do the talking, leave her alone.
Yes.
So that was, I suppose, my first experience of those kind of mixed groups. Then when I was, the work I was most interested in was, I suppose the work I was doing a lot when I met you, Tom, was Shakespeare on the one hand. They're all basically blokes' parts. And so in traditional, for want of a better word, companies, there'd be far more boys than girls. And then also, improv and comedy. And when I was young, if I think about it, it was all, not the 9 o'clock news. There was one woman, Monty Python, don't really go there. That they sort of said the balance is very, very male. But even outside those contexts, in a social context, I have no sisters. So the sort of the first talking I was doing was among peers, was with my brothers. And then, I have had girl friends all the way through my childhood and adolescence. And I was just thinking about, to the extent, the way in which that shaped my assessment of this.
Now, I remember Keith Johnston, who is the improvisation guru, some of whose views about gender and such like things can also be seen as fairly binary, regressive and old-fashioned. But I think he accurately said that one of the reasons that women find this a challenging environment is because often you're starting with a very male-heavy group. And so when the boys try and encourage the girls in, they think that if they treat the females the way they treat each other, then they'll feel like part of the group. But I remember Keith writing, I think accurately, for many people, most women find male bonding rituals absolutely horrifying and terrifying.
Well, let's talk about what those male bonding rituals are.
And I think it's very bound up in male aggression.
Yeah.
Now, there are some horrifying statistics about violence and the gender split. It's not inaccurate to say that if men stopped killing, killing would stop. Most of the world's killing is done by men to other men, although a proportion is done by men to women. Women don't murder at anything like the same rate. And so a lot of male bonding is about either physically dominating or pretending to physically dominate other men, or emasculating other men.
Yes, well, it's just this sort of viciously, violently competitive dimension. And there's also these sort of important questions, I think, about the extent to which that's driven entirely by the hormone balances within the person, or whether it's a kind of almost like a conspiracy between our bodies and the society that we live in, which sort of validates that kind of behavior and normalizes it, and also suggests that that is the norm.
Well, this is why I think this phrase locker room talk is so pernicious. I remember it being used by defenders of Donald Trump when he was running for president. It's used to excuse horrifying ways of talking about other people, particularly men talking about women. Oh, it's just locker room talk. Oh, it's just banter. It doesn't mean anything. But when your conversation normalizes those kinds of attitudes, then people who think secret, dark, private thoughts can be encouraged to come to the conclusion, oh, that's normal. That's what everybody thinks, whether they say it or not.
Yes. I mean, the reason I gave it this title when I was thinking about this episode was because of that event in 2016 when basically Bush, it was a hot mic incident, of course, and that's kind of relevant about the sort of the private or the public context in which different modes of conversation take place. He was on a bus with Billy Bush talking about, effectively describing a pattern of sexual assault.
Yes.
And as if that was fine. And Billy Bush joined in and enjoyed it. But the first time I heard the phrase uttered by somebody on the radio, it was by a woman within the campaign team. The normalizing of it can often take place within the kind of alliances across the genders. You sometimes hear proud mums talking about, oh, boys will be boys. It's a phrase used by women as well as men, even if it's got problems. I wonder if it links to this whole thing about a private space to explore ways of thinking that are exclusive to a particular group. So I was thinking about when you overhear people talking among themselves when you're not one of them, you often kind of get an insight into maybe the way at least the way they talk to each other, if it's not the way they think specifically as individuals.
But the hot mic thing, I think, is instructive here as well. If what you're saying among a private coterie of trusted individuals is something which you think would reflect on you very badly, if it were to be heard by a wider audience, maybe you shouldn't be saying it at all. Here's a conundrum that was given to me at a training event many years ago, and I'd be interested to know what you thought of it. A woman who was much more experienced than I was, quite a lot older than I was, asked me, what do you do if you overhear people in your organization who are senior to you talking about other people or other groups of people in a disparaging way,
derogatory fashion,
is inappropriate or offensive? Tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'd say that that really raises questions about how an organization works up and down the sort of the power chain, really. I think that a healthy organization should absolutely welcome every single piece of negative feedback which comes from further down the chain at 100%, and in fact should encourage it and should be big enough to be able to take it, and graceful enough to think about how to make changes on the basis of that input. But I know that in the real world, people further down the power chain feel very vulnerable to those in those institutions, and it would have to be, my advice for that individual will be on a case-by-case basis, dependent on a lot of, a lot of questions I'd ask about.
Because you might think that going to HR is the best thing to do, but of course HR's function is to protect the organisation, not any one individual. And so you may come up against the queasy realisation that what HR is weighing up is which of these individuals is more valuable to the organisation.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Who's the asset? I mean, if any HR people are listening and they have some insight about this, please pass it on. I'm very aware, Tom, that you and I get asked these questions because we are free agents walking into big institutions, and so we're a safe person to ask it to. But I also find that when I'm tackling it, I'm very aware that isn't my world. Those strong, powerful cultures with built-in dynamics which affect one's freedoms within them. I'm thinking about what the benefits of those groups are, made up entirely of men and entirely of women. What's the upside of a group of men just talking together? Can you think of any?
Well, I think people have always sought out groups of people with whom they have things in common. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a slightly awkward word to use, but I think it's such a powerful one that I can't find a better one. We look for tribes. So you and I, Alex, are in the actor tribe. We're also in the British person tribe. We're also in the white person tribe. We're in the namby-pamby, hand-wringing liberal tribe, as opposed to the aggressive locker room talk banter tribe. And so when you find people who you have that instant thing in common with, then you can associate with them. And the power of that is in its ability to bring people together. But it has a very strong negative component as well, which is for the tribe to stay whole, it also has to have mechanisms for keeping people who don't belong out. And that's where the problems start.
Yeah, I think also groups can develop a kind of a sort of a party line very easily. That this is what we think about something.
Yes.
And that we all have to kind of learn that line and maintain it, rather than allow for a sort of a more complex variety within it. And I think that's a real headache.
Yeah, so locker room banter, I think, is composed of two things. It's composed, firstly, of establishing that the men in this locker room are better than all the men outside it, and vastly better than any women. And then it's about establishing the pecking order inside that locker room.
Within it, yeah.
And it's arguably a more safe and efficient way of doing it with verbal point scoring than by physical fist fighting. But there's always the danger that if you are bested by words, you'll retaliate with fists or worse. So there is this sort of latent hint of violence underneath it, which is why I find it so distressing to be around.
Well, let's look at this a little bit as well, about sort of the jokey side of it all. Because one way in which people who are accidentally hot-mic'd in those kinds of conversations will attempt to slightly ameliorate the damage, it's called, is to say, no, we're joking. And that one of the problems that women in those environments suddenly face is they're expected to live with sort of a vision of the patriarchy as if it's just something to laugh about, whereas actually it's not. The kind of the microaggression that accretes over time is really painful. I like there to be a fun atmosphere, but I'm also very conscious that jokes are very often about status games, which are often sometimes a sort of a proxy for violence and competition. And a safe place for people to play with that. I'm often assuming it, I think, but establishing it is slightly different.
Yeah, you can establish that you are someone who is happy to take a joke by lowering your own status, for example.
Tease me, please tease me.
That rarely happens in these locker room interactions. It's always about someone else establishing dominance by lowering someone else's status.
By lowering somebody else's status, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
And there's an argument for eventually everybody gets a jab in, everybody proves that they can take a joke, and it becomes a leveler. But it's a very risky strategy, I think.
Yeah. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where, just as thinking myself of when I was at sixth form, particularly, the theatre group I was part of was very women heavy. And this may be relevant. I was a really late developer as a teenager, and so I think I found for a brief period that I was very painful in retrospect, treated as an honorary girl sometimes, and so I suddenly found myself, and this obviously wasn't happening at home because just brothers. I'd suddenly found myself sort of being there as a conversation about menstruation and boys, which I felt almost like a fly on the wall for. And so if any of my friends, mates from that time listening to this, hello. And that was kind of, it's an interesting experience. Sometimes it is when you're literally overhearing a group of women talking together and you're on the other side of the divider in the cafe. Sometimes it's, you're the only man in the room. And that sometimes happens to me at work, incidentally, in that sometimes I'm leading a group and it just happens to be entirely women.
Yeah.
That's a particular kind of atmosphere. You've had that experience much?
Not as a teenager in the way that you have, but definitely I've turned up to training sessions and everyone there's been a woman. And it is awkward again for me as an namby-pamby, hand-wringing liberal to be standing in front of them as the epitome of the patriarchy.
Well, exactly.
Saying, now, girls, let me tell you something you don't know. But that's, I think, largely my paranoia. I've never had that sort of pushback.
Mm. No, nor I. So thank you very much, all of you who's ever attended to those. I'm aware that maybe because of the power dynamic, this is it would be a very, very different conversation talking about how women talk together. I remember, however hard we worked on issues about patriarchy within the Spontaneity Shop, there came a point in which we started running, or Deborah and the women in the group started running Hell on Heels improv nights, in which there were women-only improv companies, because whatever our ambitions as individuals politically, we live within a massive society which works the way it does. And I know that providing a safe space for the more marginalized group of people is different.
But I do look back on that group now and I see it as very binary.
Yeah.
We were doing lots of stories about boys and girls falling in love.
Yes.
And we had one gay member of the cast, and we would occasionally do male gay romance stories and be very pleased with ourselves for so doing. But there was no hint of any more gender fluidity, and there certainly wasn't any members of the cast who were anything other than white.
That's true.
So looking back on it now, I find I was merely paying lip service to a lot of these ideas of diversity and inclusion, which I professed to champion.
Yeah.
I'm not really part of this world anymore, but I see online people taking really proactive steps to try and change this perception of theatre in general and improvisation in particular as being exclusively white, predominantly male, predominantly straight, which is also kind of a little bit curious when you consider the reputation of Broadway, for example.
Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that when we talk about just conversation, we want it to be as artless and as unconscious as possible. Okay. Whereas when we think about these questions, which are, these qualities are things that would just happen to us. We didn't choose to be this way. No. And so having to be conscious about, what am I saying? Who am I saying it to? What structure do I live within? That isn't something that people associate with the ease and authenticity that people are seeking when they just sit down and talk to other people. So I think that's one reason why this is a slightly gnarly question. Maybe when people are saying, when they recognize other people and they say, oh, well, it's easy for you. They are seeing behavior and assuming that it's as artless and as unconscious as their own, as the way that they tackle things. But actually, maybe it is product of a much more conscious and deliberate way of engaging with others. I was thinking about when I was at a party on Christmas Eve, and I found myself sitting in the kitchen with 2 other men and no women. And we literally ended up talking about cars because I just got a car. It was hilarious. And I'm not a particularly car person, but I ended up asking them about things like the cruise control. And then in came Alicia. And I remember thinking, right, I'm now going to have to consciously and deliberately pick people up and bring them into the conversation and include them. So it was kind of...
on the one hand is generous and inclusive, and I applaud you for it. On the other hand, though, it seems to be guided by the thought, well, a girl couldn't possibly have anything to add to a conversation about cars.
It was... I think the car bit and the arrival of the woman in the conversation was slightly separate. But I was just very aware that it became quite a blokey conversation with the men. But I remember thinking, I'm now going to be deliberate because I can see the eye contact patterns that are happening from the people, these 3 men who've been talking for ages. And here is someone coming to join the conversation. So we are going to now be deliberately inclusive. And I'm very conscious of the pattern while I'm getting it going. But I'm also, in retrospect, thinking, I wonder how conscious and deliberate that will have looked from the outside. So I think that for those of you who are listening to this, I'd say your homework for the week is to be don't be embarrassed about being deliberately conscious of the gender balance of the group that you're talking with, and make deliberate steps to break what unconscious and inherited patterns that have been part of that conversation so far. Because however conscious and clunky and heavy it may feel to you, it will still achieve a different and pattern-breaking outcome for everybody else. And if there's one thing I've learned about talking to people in my time, if you make it about you, it doesn't work so well.
Indeed. Well, we run training sessions on all of these topics. We run them in person and on Zoom. We discuss things like better client meetings, smoother negotiations, presenting with confidence. So if you're interested in working with us, then get in touch. You can send us an email, info@thespontaneity.shop.com, or give the Spontaneity Shop a call on 020 7788 4080.
Please feel free to get in touch with your questions and challenges for this podcast, and tune in next week. All the best, and happy 2022.
Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
You have been listening to You Can Talk to Anyone with Alex McLaren and Tom Salinsky. The producer for The Spontaneity Shop was Tom Salinsky. You Can Talk to Anyone is distributed exclusively by Acast.